It was early morning on the Dawson family farm, and everything seemed calm and peaceful. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the fields. Emily Dawson, a young woman in her early 20s, was out in the yard, doing her usual morning chores. She wore old jeans, dirt streaked from the hard work she did every day, and a faded shirt that had seen better days. Her long blonde hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and her skin was tan from working outside under the hot sun. To anyone passing by, Emily looked like just an ordinary farmer's daughter. She was the type of girl who kept to herself, worked hard, and didn't make a fuss about anything. The people in the nearby town saw her as kind and quiet, a simple girl who spent most of her days tending to the animals and crops on her father's farm. The locals didn't know much about her family. They only knew that Emily lived alone with her father, John Dawson, a quiet man who rarely spoke and kept to himself even more than Emily did. John Dawson was a man of few words. His face, lined with age and hard work, rarely showed emotion. He was tall and strong, with gray hair and a worn look in his eyes that made people wonder what he had been through in life. Some of the older folks in town remembered when John first moved to the farm many years ago, but no one knew much about his past. He had never shared his story, and no one had ever asked. Over time, people stopped wondering about the mysterious man who lived outside of town. He was just a quiet farmer now, living out his days in peace. But John Dawson wasn't always a farmer. Long before Emily was born, John had lived a very different life. He had been a man of action, someone who had once walked a dangerous path filled with risks and enemies. His past was filled with secrets, things he had locked away deep inside, never to be spoken of again. He had left that life behind, hoping to find peace in the quiet of the countryside. Now, his days were filled with the simple joys of farm life, watching the crops grow, feeding the animals, and spending time with Emily. Emily loved the farm. She had grown up there, learning everything about the land from her father. She knew how to plant seeds, tend to the livestock, and fix broken fences. Her hands were calloused from years of hard work, but she didn't mind. The farm was her home, and she felt safe there with her father. She never asked him about his past, even though she sometimes caught glimpses of something deeper in his eyes, something that hinted at a life she couldn't imagine. Everything changed one summer day when trouble came to the farm, roaring down the dusty road on the back of loud motorcycles. A group of bikers, covered in tattoos and wearing leather jackets, rode up to the farmhouse. The sound of their engines broke the usual quiet of the countryside, sending birds flying from the trees and making the animals restless in their pens. Emily, who was feeding the chickens at the time, looked up in surprise. It wasn't often that they had visitors, and these men didn't look like they were there for a friendly chat. The leader of the group, a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and dark sunglasses, was the first to speak. "Nice place you got here," he said, his voice rough and intimidating. His eyes scanned the farm, lingering on Emily for a moment before moving to the old house where John stood watching from the porch. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen tough men before, but something about this group felt different. They didn't belong here, and their presence filled the air with tension. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped closer to the porch, where her father remained calm, his face unreadable. John said nothing at first. He simply stood there, his hands resting on the old wooden cane he always carried. It was more than just a walking stick. John had used it to steady himself ever since a long ago injury that no one ever asked about. He looked at the bikers with a steady gaze, his blue eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't intimidated, not even by the menacing look of the gang or the way they eyed his daughter. The leader smirked, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "We're just passing through, old man. Thought we'd stop by, see what's what. Maybe we could work something out, you know? A little protection for your farm. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it." Emily's heart raced. She understood the threat in the man's words. These men were dangerous, and they were here to cause trouble. But her father didn't move. He didn't flinch or show any sign of fear. Instead, he simply looked at the man and spoke in a low, even voice. "You don't belong here," John said calmly. "This is private land. I suggest you keep riding." For a moment, the air seemed to freeze. The leader's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. He hadn't expected resistance from the quiet old farmer. "Is that so?" he asked, stepping closer to the porch. "You think you can tell us what to do?" John didn't answer. He just stared at the man, his expression hard and unreadable. The other bikers, sensing the tension, began to shift restlessly on their bikes. The leader clenched his fists, clearly not used to being challenged. But before anything else could happen, one of the other bikers laughed and revved his engine, breaking the moment. "Come on, Brick," the man said, grinning. "This old man ain't worth it. Let's get out of here." The leader, Brick, hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't ready to push things further yet. "We'll be back," he said, turning to Emily with a cold smile. "You think about what I said, girl. We'll see you around." With that, the gang roared off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. Emily watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to her father, who was still standing on the porch, his face as calm as ever. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the cane a little tighter than before. "Who were they?" she asked quietly. John looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Trouble," he said simply. "And they'll be back." Emily didn't ask any more questions. She trusted her father, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dark and dangerous. And for the first time, she began to wonder about the past her father had never spoken of. Emily didn't say anything more to her father after the bikers left, but she could feel a change in the air. Her father, John, seemed to retreat even further into himself that day. He went about his usual work, feeding the animals, fixing the fence, and tending to the crops, but there was a heaviness in his movements, a kind of quiet tension that made Emily worry. She had never seen him like this before. The farm had always been a peaceful place, a sanctuary for both of them. For as long as Emily could remember, it had just been her and her father. Her mother had passed away when she was very young, and John had raised her on his own. He had taught her everything she knew about farm life: how to take care of the animals, how to grow crops, how to fix things when they broke. It had been a simple life, but Emily loved it. She loved the quiet, the routine, the sense of security that came with knowing the farm was theirs. But now, that sense of security felt threatened. The bikers had brought a darkness with them, a feeling that things were no longer safe. Emily had never felt afraid on the farm before, but now she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something bad was going to happen. She didn't know much about the world outside the farm, but she knew enough to recognize danger when she saw it. And those bikers, especially their leader, Brick, were dangerous. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day: the roar of the motorcycles, the smug look on Brick's face, the way her father had stood so still and silent as if he were holding something back. She wondered what he was thinking, what he knew that she didn't. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, Emily finally got up and walked to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the farm. Everything looked calm and peaceful, just as it always did. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was only temporary. The bikers had said they would be back, and she believed them. She glanced toward her father's room. The door was closed, and she could hear the faint sound of his snoring. He was asleep, or at least he seemed to be. Emily wasn't so sure. Her father was a man of few words, but she had always known there was more to him than met the eye. He had never talked about his past, and she had never asked. It wasn't that she didn't care, she did, but it was more that she had always felt there were things he didn't want to share, and she had respected that. They had always had a quiet understanding between them. But now, for the first time, she found herself wanting to know more. Who was her father, really? And what had he done before he became the quiet, hard-working farmer she had always known? Emily sighed and leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She wished she could talk to him, ask him the questions that were now swirling in her mind. But she didn't know how to bring it up, didn't know if he would even answer. Her father was a private man, and she didn't want to push him. Still, she couldn't help but feel that whatever was coming, they needed to face it together. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension lingered. John went about his work as usual, but Emily could see that he was on edge. He kept glancing toward the road, as if expecting the bikers to return at any moment. Emily tried to focus on her own tasks, but it was hard to concentrate with the constant worry gnawing at her. She couldn't stop thinking about what her father had said, "They'll be back." And they were. It was late afternoon when Emily heard the familiar roar of motorcycles in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly wiped her hands on her jeans, hurrying to the front of the house. Her father was already there, standing on the porch with his arms crossed, watching the road. The bikers appeared moments later, their engines loud and aggressive as they pulled up to the farmhouse. Brick was in the lead, as usual. He parked his bike and swung one leg over, standing tall and confident as he removed his sunglasses and looked around. His eyes settled on John, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Nice to see you again, old man," Brick said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We thought we'd drop by, see if you've had time to think about our offer." John didn't say anything. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. Emily stood a few feet behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't like the way Brick was looking at her father, or the way the other bikers were spreading out around the yard, as if they owned the place. "We don't need your protection," John said quietly, his voice steady but firm. Brick laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Oh, I think you do. See, out here, things can go wrong real quick. Accidents happen all the time. Would be a shame if something were to happen to this nice little farm of yours. You wouldn't want that, would you?" John's grip on his cane tightened, but he didn't respond. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. She could feel the anger radiating off him, but he kept it in check, kept his voice calm. "I told you to leave," John said. "This is private property." Brick's smile faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. "You don't get it, do you, old man? I'm giving you a chance to make things easy. But if you want to do this the hard way, I'm more than happy to oblige." The other bikers, sensing the shift in tone, began to move closer. Emily's heart raced as she watched them, fear creeping up her spine. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if her father could handle this, and she felt helpless standing there, watching the situation escalate. But then, something happened that she didn't expect. Her father, who had always been so calm and composed, suddenly took a step forward. His face was hard, his eyes cold as he looked Brick directly in the eye. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," John said, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity that made Emily shiver. Brick blinked, taken aback for a moment, but then he laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. "Oh yeah? And who exactly are you, old man?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out something that Emily had never seen before, a leather patch, old and worn, but still clearly recognizable. It was a symbol, one that instantly made the color drain from Brick's face. The other bikers, who had been inching closer, froze in their tracks. Emily didn't understand what was happening, but she could see the fear in their eyes, the way they suddenly hesitated. Brick stared at the patch, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "No way," he muttered under his breath. You're not." John didn't say anything. He just held the patch up for a moment longer before tucking it back into his jacket. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He wasn't backing down. Brick took a step back, his bravado suddenly gone. "I didn't know," he said, his voice quieter now, almost respectful. "I didn't know it was you." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message was clear: Brick and his gang had made a mistake, a big one. They had underestimated the quiet farmer, the man they thought was just another easy target. But John Dawson was far more than they had ever imagined. After a tense moment of silence, Brick turned to his crew. "We're leaving," he said sharply. The bikers didn't argue. They quickly mounted their bikes and started their engines, the roar filling the air once again. Brick was the last to get on his bike. He gave John one last look, a mix of fear and respect in his eyes, before he sped off down the road, his gang following close behind. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Emily finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to her father, her mind racing with questions, but before she could say anything, he spoke. "It's over," John said quietly, though there was a weariness in his voice that made Emily think it wasn't really over at all. Emily stared at her father, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the road, his expression distant, as if he were seeing something from long ago. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes filled with a sadness that Emily had never seen before. Emily could feel the weight of their stares, their jeers hanging in the air like thick smoke. The laughter from the bikers was cold, filled with the kind of arrogance that comes from people who have gotten away with far too much for far too long. "Why don't you smile for us, darling?" one of them called out. His voice was dripping with mockery, his grin wide and unkind. But Emily didn't react. She kept her eyes on the ground, her mind racing. She could feel the fear bubbling up inside her, but she refused to let them see it. She had always been taught that fear was something you held close, something you never let anyone else see, especially not men like this. "Hey, I'm talking to you," another biker said, his voice sharper now, annoyed by her silence. One of the bikers dismounted his motorcycle, stepping closer to her. His boots crunched on the gravel, his eyes dark and dangerous. "You deaf or something, girl?" Emily felt her throat tighten, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Leave her alone." John Dawson's voice was steady and cold, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. He stepped out of the house, his hand resting on his cane. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step carefully measured. The bikers turned to face him, and for a moment, there was silence. Brick, the leader, let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, look who it is. The old man finally shows up." Brick was a big man, with a square jaw and eyes that gleamed with mischief. He swaggered over to John, his hands on his hips, looking the older man up and down with a smirk on his face. "What are you gonna do, old man? Wave that cane at us? You should know better than to get involved." John didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on Brick, unwavering. "I said, leave her alone." Brick's grin widened as he leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour in the cool evening air. "Or what? You gonna make us?" The other bikers laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet countryside. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but her father didn't move. She could see the tension in his body, the way his muscles tightened under his shirt. She had never seen him like this before, so still, so calm. But there was something dangerous simmering just beneath the surface. "I don't want trouble," John said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you don't leave now, you'll regret it." Brick's smile faltered just slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like John. But he quickly recovered, snorting and shaking his head. "You're really starting to get on my nerves, old man." Brick took a step closer, his hand reaching out to shove John back. But before he could make contact, John moved. It happened so fast, Emily almost didn't see it. John's cane shot up, knocking Brick's hand away with a sharp crack that echoed in the air. The other bikers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Brick stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief. He hadn't expected this. You crazy old fool." Brick spat, rubbing his wrist. "You're gonna regret that." John didn't say anything. He just stood there, his grip on the cane tight, his eyes locked on Brick. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the silence heavy. Then, slowly, Brick regained his composure. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You've made a big mistake," Brick said, his voice low and menacing. "We're not just gonna walk away from this." John's gaze didn't waver. "Then you'll find out what a bigger mistake looks like." Brick glared at him for a long moment before finally turning to his gang. "Let's go. We'll deal with this later." The bikers revved their engines, the roar of the motorcycles filling the air as they peeled away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. But as they disappeared down the road, Emily knew they would be back. They had made it clear that this wasn't over. John stood there for a long time after they left, his eyes following the trail of dust in the distance. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the cane like it was the only thing holding him steady. "Dad," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "Are you okay?" John didn't answer right away. He finally turned to her, his face lined with worry. "I'm fine, Emily. But this isn't over. They'll come back. And when they do, it's going to get worse." Emily swallowed hard, her heart sinking. She had known from the start that this was trouble, but now it felt like they were standing on the edge of something much bigger, something much darker than she had imagined. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John looked out at the road, his jaw clenched. "We'll be ready." Over the next few days, the tension on the farm was unbearable. Every time Emily heard the faint sound of an engine in the distance, her heart leapt into her throat. She couldn't stop thinking about what her father had said about how they needed to be ready. Ready for what, though? She didn't know. She couldn't picture her father fighting. He was a peaceful man, a farmer who had always valued hard work and honesty over violence. But now, everything felt different. John didn't say much during those days. He spent most of his time in the barn, working on things Emily couldn't quite see. Every now and then, she would catch him sharpening tools, or checking the locks on the doors and windows, as if preparing for something. One evening, after dinner, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what her father was thinking. "Dad," she said as they sat at the kitchen table, the faint light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. "What are you planning?" John looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm planning to protect you." Emily frowned. "But how? What if they come back with more men? What if they try to hurt you?" John's eyes softened for a moment, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "Emily, I've been through worse than this. I know how to handle men like them." Emily searched his face, trying to understand. "But why, Dad? Why didn't you ever tell me about your past?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I didn't want you to grow up with that hanging over you." I left that life behind a long time ago. I didn't think it would ever come back. Emily stared at him, her mind racing. She had always known her father was strong, but she had never seen this side of him before. The way he stood up to Brick, the way he moved so quickly, so precisely, it was like he was someone else entirely. "Who were you, Dad?" she asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity and fear. John was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if he were remembering something from a lifetime ago. Finally, he spoke. "I was someone you wouldn't recognize. Someone I'm not proud of." Emily waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up from the table, his movements slow and deliberate. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Emily wanted to push him for more answers, but she knew her father well enough to know that when he didn't want to talk about something, there was no changing his mind. So she nodded, standing up from the table and heading upstairs to her room. But as she lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Something dangerous. And no matter how much her father tried to protect her, she knew that they were both caught in something far bigger than either of them could control. The next morning, Emily awoke to the sound of birds singing outside her window. It was a peaceful sound, one that usually filled her with a sense of calm. But today, it only served as a stark contrast to the anxiety that had settled deep in her chest. As she dressed and headed downstairs, she found her father already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than usual, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "We need to talk about a plan," he said without preamble as she sat down across from him. Emily nodded, her stomach knotting with nerves. "Okay. What do we do?" John took a deep breath. "First, we make sure the farm is secure. I've already reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, but I'm going to set up some additional defenses around the property. Just in case." "Defenses?" Emily repeated, her eyebrows shooting up. "Like what?" John's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Nothing too extreme. Just a few things to slow them down if they try to come back." Emily wasn't sure what that meant, but she trusted her father. If he said they needed defenses, then they needed defenses. "And if they do come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's expression hardened. "If they come back, we'll be ready for them." The next few days were a blur of preparation. John worked tirelessly, setting up hidden traps around the property, reinforcing the barn, and making sure that everything was as secure as possible. Emily helped where she could, though she often felt like she was in over her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father was preparing for something far worse than just a confrontation with a few bikers. It was as if he were gearing up for war. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily finally voiced the question that had been on her mind for days. "Dad, do you think we're really going to have to fight them?" John was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I hope not," he said quietly. "But if they force our hand, we won't have a choice." Emily swallowed hard, her heart heavy. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want any of this. But she knew her father was right. The bikers weren't going to stop. Not unless they made them. As the darkness settled around them, Emily felt a sense of foreboding wash over her. Something was coming. She could feel it. And no matter how much they prepared, she wasn't sure they were ready for what lay ahead. The days dragged on with the tension on the farm growing thicker each time the bikers came back. It started with small things. Brick and his gang would drive their motorcycles up and down the road at all hours, revving their engines loudly enough to scare the animals. They'd park just outside the farm, watching Emily and John as they worked. The looks on their faces were a mixture of amusement and menace, like they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. Emily noticed how they tried to make her uncomfortable. They'd whistle at her, call out crude remarks when she passed by, trying to get under her skin. But she refused to give them the satisfaction. She kept her head held high, her face calm, never letting them see that they were getting to her. Inside, though, she felt a knot of anxiety growing tighter each day. John, on the other hand, grew quieter. He never said much to begin with, but now he spoke even less. He watched everything, his eyes sharp, his face set in a grim line. Emily could see the weight of worry pulling him down, though he tried to hide it from her. Every time the bikers showed up, he was there, standing in the background, just observing. The bikers thought he was harmless, just an old man with nothing left in him. But Emily knew better. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands sometimes drifted toward his cane, as if remembering a time when it wasn't just a walking stick. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the fields, Emily and her father sat on the porch in silence. The air was thick with the smells of summer freshly cut grass, warm earth, and the faint scent of hay from the barn. But neither of them was enjoying the peacefulness. The bikers had been circling the farm all day, their presence a constant reminder of the trouble that was brewing. Emily glanced over at her father. He was staring out at the horizon, his face unreadable. She knew he was thinking about them, the bikers. He hadn't said a word about them since the day they first showed up. But she could feel the tension in him, like a storm building inside, just waiting to break. "Dad," Emily began softly, her voice tentative. She hadn't wanted to push him, but she couldn't hold back any longer. "Who are they? Why are they doing this?" John didn't respond at first. He continued to stare out into the distance, his eyes dark and shadowed by years of untold stories. Emily waited, knowing better than to rush him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, as if he were carefully choosing his words. "They think they can take what they want because they've never been told no," he said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Men like that, they only understand one thing." Emily frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "But why us? What do they want from us?" John finally turned to look at her. His expression was heavy, weighed down by something she couldn't quite understand. "It's not about us, Emily. It's about them. People like Brick, they thrive on fear. They think if they push hard enough, we'll just give in. But we won't," Emily said firmly, though there was a flicker of doubt in her voice. She was trying to stay strong, but the constant pressure was wearing on her. The bikers hadn't done anything yet, not really. But their presence, the way they loomed over the farm like vultures, made her feel like they were just waiting for the right moment to swoop in and tear everything apart. "No, we won't," John agreed, his voice a little harder now. "But they don't know that yet." There was a long pause, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Emily could sense that her father was holding something back, something important. She had felt it ever since the bikers first appeared. There was more to this than just a group of thugs trying to intimidate them. She just didn't know what. "Dad," she said again, this time more urgently. "There's something you're not telling me. I can feel it. Please, I need to know." John hesitated, his jaw tightening. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I wasn't always a farmer, Emily." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. She had always known there was more to her father than the quiet, hard-working man who had raised her. But he had never talked about his past, not once. Now, she could feel the weight of the secrets he had been carrying all these years. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Before you were born, I was a different man. I lived a different life. One that I walked away from a long time ago. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had always suspected that her father's past wasn't as simple as he had let on. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. I was part of a group, John continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. We did things I'm not proud of. We were dangerous men. Men like Brick and his gang, they remind me of the people I used to run with. Emily's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. Her father had been part of a gang. A real gang. Not the kind of thugs that rode around on motorcycles trying to scare people, but something more. Something darker. Why did you leave? She asked, her heart pounding in her chest. John was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to tell her. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with regret. I left because I wanted a different life. For you. When your mother and I found out she was pregnant, I knew I couldn't keep living the way I was. I didn't want that life for you, for our family. So I walked away. Emily sat back, trying to process everything her father had just told her. It was hard to reconcile the man she had known all her life with the one he was describing. But in a strange way, it made sense. The way he carried himself, the way he never seemed afraid, even when things got tough. It wasn't just because he was strong. It was because he had lived through things she couldn't even imagine. Does Brick know? Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. John shook his head. No. And I intend to keep it that way. But if they push us any further. His voice trailed off, and Emily could hear the unspoken threat hanging in the air. For the first time, Emily felt a flicker of real fear. Not for herself, but for her father. She had always known he was strong, but now she understood that he was also dangerous. And if Brick and his gang pushed too far, they would find out just how dangerous he could be. The bikers continued to visit the farm, their presence becoming more frequent and more invasive. They would ride through the fields, tearing up the dirt with their tires, leaving deep ruts in the ground that made it hard for John and Emily to work. They'd knock things over, leave trash behind, and once, they even smashed the old wooden fence that bordered the property. Each time they came, John would stand there, silent and unflinching, watching them with the same cold, steady gaze. Emily could see the way it bothered Brick, how her father's calmness made him uneasy. But it also seemed to make him more determined to break them. One day, Brick and his gang showed up again, but this time they didn't just ride through the fields or make rude comments. This time, they came with a purpose. Brick parked his motorcycle right in front of the farmhouse, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped off. He looked around with a smug grin, his eyes landing on Emily as she stood on the porch, her arms crossed, trying to keep her fear at bay. Time's up, sweetheart, Brick said, his voice loud and mocking. We've been real patient, but now it's time to pay up. Emily's heart raced. She glanced over at her father, who stood a few feet away, his face set in a grim line. You need to leave, John said, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. Brick laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Leave? Oh, I don't think so, old man. You see, we've been real nice about this whole thing, but now I think it's time we showed you what happens when people don't play along. One of the bikers stepped forward, holding a crowbar. He swung it casually in his hand, his eyes gleaming with malice. This place is looking a little too nice for my taste. Maybe we should fix that. John's grip on his cane tightened, but he didn't move. Emily could feel the tension in the air, the way everything seemed to hang on a knife's edge. Her father had always been a man of peace, but she could see that peace slipping away, replaced by something darker, something that had been buried deep for a long time. You don't want to do this, John said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. Brick sneered. Oh, but I do. In fact, I think I'm gonna enjoy this. He nodded to the biker with the crowbar. Go ahead. Show 'em what happens when people don't listen. The biker grinned, raising the crowbar high, ready to swing. Before Emily could react, John moved. It was so fast, she barely saw it happen. One moment, he was standing still, and the next, he had disarmed the biker, the crowbar clattering to the ground. The biker stumbled back, shock written all over his face. Brick's smug expression faltered. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. John stepped forward, his eyes locked on Brick. Leave. Now. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Then, slowly, Brick backed away, his hands raised in mock surrender. All right, he said, though his voice was strained. We'll go. For now. The gang followed Brick, their faces a mixture of fear and anger as they mounted their bikes and roared off down the road. As the dust settled and the noise faded, Emily turned to her father, her heart pounding in her chest. Dad, what just happened? John didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring after the bikers, his face hard and unreadable. They'll be back, he said quietly. And next time, it'll be worse. Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew he was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now, she also knew that her father was not just a farmer. He was something else, something far more dangerous. And the bikers had just woken that part of him up. The bikers stood frozen, their sneers slowly fading into confusion and disbelief. Brick's eyes were glued to the jacket, his bravado slipping away as recognition dawned. He had heard stories, whispers, really about a man who had once ruled the streets with an iron fist. A man whose name was spoken only in hushed tones by those who had lived to tell the tale. And now, standing before him, was that very man, the one he never thought he'd encounter in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world. John Dawson, the farmer they had mocked, was not just a nobody. He was a legend. Brick's fingers twitched at his side, his instincts telling him to reach for the knife he always carried, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way John stood calm, steady, unafraid. Maybe it was the weight of the jacket, the symbol on the back that carried a history Brick didn't want to face. Or maybe it was the cold look in John's eyes, a look that told him that this man was not bluffing. What is this? One of the younger bikers muttered, his voice shaky. He glanced at Brick, looking for answers, but found none. John took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. He didn't rush, didn't need to. The power of his presence alone was enough to make the gang shift uneasily. I tried to leave that life behind, John said, his voice low but carrying easily in the tense silence. But men like you always push too far. You think you can walk over anyone, that you're untouchable. But every bully meets their match. Brick, still holding onto the last shreds of his confidence, squared his shoulders and spat on the ground. You think we're scared of some old jacket? Times have changed, old man. John tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Yes, they have. But some things stay the same. Without warning, John lunged forward, faster than anyone expected. His movements were swift, almost too fast to track. Before Brick could react, John had disarmed him, twisting the knife out of his hand with a brutal efficiency that left the gang stunned. The knife clattered to the ground, and Brick stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his eyes wide with shock. The other bikers, sensing that things were spiraling out of control, hesitated. They weren't used to seeing their leader on the defensive, especially against a man who should have been too old and too slow to pose a threat. But John wasn't just any man. He was someone who had survived the kind of violence they could only dream of. And now, After years of keeping that part of himself buried, he had let it rise to the surface once again. Brick's face twisted in anger, but there was fear in his eyes now, too. "You're gonna regret that, old man," he growled, backing up toward his bike. "You think you can take us all on by yourself?" John didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. They had never seen Brick back down from a fight, but here he was, retreating in the face of a man they had underestimated from the start. One of the bikers, a burly man with a shaved head, finally broke the silence. "We don't need this, Brick. Let's just go. We'll deal with him later." But Brick wasn't ready to admit defeat. His pride wouldn't let him walk away without trying to save face. "No," he snapped, his voice rising. "We finish this. He's just one man." John's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the calm exterior he had been holding onto slipped. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I'm more than enough." Brick hesitated, torn between his pride and the very real danger standing in front of him. But before he could make a decision, one of his men stepped forward, emboldened by his leader's indecision. "Let's see how tough you really are, old man," the biker sneered, pulling out a chain from his belt and swinging it threateningly. John didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he stepped back, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The biker swung the chain, aiming for John's head, but John ducked effortlessly, grabbing the biker's arm and twisting it with such force that the man dropped the chain with a cry of pain. In a single, fluid motion, John pushed the biker to the ground, his body hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The rest of the gang watched in stunned silence as John stood over the fallen biker, his face as calm as ever. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Leave now, before this gets worse." Brick's face was a mask of rage, but behind it, there was fear. He knew he had lost control of the situation. He knew that this man, this quiet, unassuming farmer, was far more dangerous than any of them had realized. But pride was a powerful thing, and Brick wasn't ready to back down just yet. He motioned to the rest of his gang, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Get him." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. They were used to winning by numbers, by overwhelming their opponents with brute force. But now, facing John, they realized that numbers might not be enough. Still, they weren't about to walk away without a fight. Two of them stepped forward, circling John like wolves hunting their prey. They thought they had him outnumbered, but what they didn't know was that John had spent years fighting men exactly like them and worse. The first biker lunged, swinging a crowbar toward John's head, but John sidestepped easily, his movements quick and precise. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the biker dropped the crowbar with a yelp of pain. Before the other biker could react, John kicked the crowbar away, sending it skidding across the dirt. The second biker, seeing his chance, charged at John with a roar. But John was ready. With a swift, calculated movement, he grabbed the biker by the collar and flipped him over his shoulder, slamming him into the ground with a thud. The rest of the gang watched in disbelief as their men were taken down one by one. Brick's face was pale now, all traces of his earlier confidence gone. He had never seen anything like this before. He had never faced someone who fought with such skill, such precision. John stood in the center of the chaos, his expression unreadable. He wasn't even out of breath. "You're out of your league," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Brick. "Take your men and go." For a long moment, Brick didn't move. He just stood there, his fists clenched, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. But deep down, he knew John was right. There was no winning this fight. Not today. With a snarl, Brick turned to his men. "Let's go, he spat, his voice filled with bitterness. The bikers, eager to escape the beating they knew was coming if they stayed, scrambled to their feet and mounted their bikes. But as Brick climbed onto his bike, he turned to John one last time, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over, old man," he growled. "You're gonna pay for this." John didn't respond. He just watched as the bikers roared off into the distance, their threats hanging in the air like the dust their tires kicked up. When they were finally gone, the silence was deafening. Emily, who had been standing on the porch, watching the entire thing unfold, finally stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad," she began, her voice shaking. What just happened?" John turned to her, his face softening. He looked older now, more tired than she had ever seen him before. "It's over," he said quietly. "For now." "But they'll come back, won't they?" Emily asked, her voice filled with worry. "They won't just let this go." John sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "No," he admitted. "They won't. But we'll be ready when they do." Emily looked at her father, the man she had thought she knew, and realized that there was so much more to him than she had ever imagined. The quiet farmer who had raised her, who had taught her everything she knew about hard work and honesty, had once been a man of violence, a man feared by dangerous people. And now, that man had been forced to come out of hiding to protect her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, her father was not a man to be underestimated. And neither was she. As the sun set over the farm, casting long shadows across the fields, Emily and John stood side by side, preparing for whatever came next. They had survived this fight, but they both knew it was just the beginning. The dust settled over the quiet Dawson farm as the roar of the bikes grew fainter, their engines slowly disappearing into the night. The tension that had filled the air only moments ago seemed to evaporate, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The only sound now was the soft crunch of gravel beneath John's boots as he slowly walked toward Emily, who stood frozen on the porch, her wide eyes still locked on the empty road. The confrontation was over. The bikers were gone. But the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, and Emily's heart was still racing. She had seen her father in action before, but this was different. This was a side of him she had never known. The calm, patient man who had raised her was also the very same man who had once struck fear into the hearts of the most dangerous people. And now, she had witnessed that power firsthand. John stopped a few feet away from Emily, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emily couldn't find the words to say. What could she say? Her father, the man she had always known as quiet and kind, had just single-handedly taken down an entire gang of bikers. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything that had happened. Was it really over? Would they come back? John finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "You all right, Em?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to shake the tightness in her chest. I think so." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "But, Dad, what just happened? Who were those people? And who are you?" John's face softened, though his eyes still held the quiet intensity of a man who had lived through things most people couldn't imagine. He took a step closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm still your father, Emily. That hasn't changed." He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "But there's more to me than what you've seen. I didn't want you to know that side of me, but I guess it's time you did." Emily's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "What do you mean? You said you were different before, but how? What happened to you?" John sighed deeply, his gaze drifting toward the horizon as if searching for the right words. "A long time ago, I wasn't just the man who ran this farm. I was someone else, a different person altogether. I used to be part of a group. A gang, really. We were the ones people feared. We made our living off violence and intimidation. But after a while, I got tired of that life. It wasn't the life I wanted for you, for us. So, I walked away. Emily was stunned. She had heard rumors over the years, whispered talks about a man named John Dawson who had been a figure in the criminal underworld. But she had never thought it was real. It was just a story, a legend. She had never imagined it could be true, that her father had once been part of something so dangerous. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Why did you keep it from me?" John looked down at the ground, his expression hardening. "I wanted to protect you. I thought if you knew about my past, it would change the way you saw me. I didn't want you to carry that burden. I thought I could keep it buried, keep it away from you. But when they came here, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to do what I had to do to keep you safe." Emily looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "But why didn't you tell me sooner? Why wait until now?" "I wasn't ready," John admitted, his voice quiet. "I thought I could keep the past where it belonged. But sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you try to run from it." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of the revelation settling between them like an invisible fog. Emily's mind was spinning, trying to process everything. She had always thought of her father as a simple man, a farmer, a protector, someone who had lived a quiet life. But now, she realized that he was much more than that. He had a history, a past that was darker and more complex than she could ever have imagined. But despite the shock and confusion, Emily knew one thing for certain: her father had protected her. He had done everything in his power to shield her from the life he had left behind, even if it meant hiding the truth from her. "Dad," Emily began, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know what to say. This is all so much to take in. But I know one thing. You've always been there for me. You've always put me first, no matter what. And that's who you are to me. Not who you were, but who you are now." John's eyes softened, and he pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this. I never wanted you to carry that burden." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Emily felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She still didn't fully understand everything, but she knew her father had done what he thought was best. And no matter what he had been in the past, the man who stood before her now was the one who had raised her, loved her, and protected her. The next few days were a blur of quiet reflection and preparation. John didn't speak much about the past, but Emily could see that it was weighing on him. The quiet life he had worked so hard to build was suddenly under threat, and the weight of his past was harder to ignore now that the bikers had come for them. As the days went on, Emily began to understand more about the world her father had left behind. He had made enemies, powerful enemies, and they would not easily be forgotten. The bikers weren't just some random group of troublemakers. They were part of a larger network, a dangerous underworld that John had once been a part of. And now that they had crossed paths again, there was no going back. But despite the looming danger, Emily refused to let fear take hold. She had learned from her father that fear was something you had to face, not something you ran from. And together, they would face whatever came next. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and John sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and purple. It had been a long, hard few days, but in that moment, they found a quiet peace. "You think they'll come back?" Emily asked, her voice soft. John glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "They might. But we'll be ready for them." Emily nodded. "We'll make sure of it." John smiled faintly, his eyes filled with pride. "You've grown strong, Em. I've always known you would." And as the night settled in around them, Emily felt a sense of resolve fill her chest. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. And whatever came next, she knew they would face it together. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in days. The tension that had gripped her for so long was finally starting to lift. It was hard to believe that only days ago, her world had been turned upside down. Now, as she stood next to her father, watching the fading light paint the sky with streaks of red and gold, she realized that they had overcome something much bigger than just the bikers. They had faced the darkness of the past and emerged stronger for it. John stood quietly beside her, his weathered face calm but resolute. He had always been a man of few words, but now, as they watched the day turn to night, Emily felt the weight of all the unsaid things between them. She had learned more about him in the last few days than she had in her entire life, and yet, she still didn't fully understand everything. But one thing was clear: her father was not just the man who ran the farm. He was a man who had lived a life full of challenges, mistakes, and regrets, but also one who had found the strength to change and rebuild, for her and for himself. "Dad," Emily said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You've protected me all these years, but I didn't know the half of it. You've been carrying so much, and I didn't even know." John turned his gaze toward her, his eyes kind but full of the wisdom of a man who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. "You don't need to thank me, Em," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've always been my reason for everything. I did what I had to do, not because I was trying to protect myself, but because I wanted to protect you. I couldn't let anything happen to you." Emily nodded, feeling the depth of his words. She had always known that her father loved her, but now she saw that his love went beyond just protecting her. It was about giving her the chance to live a life free from the mistakes of his past. He had sacrificed so much to give her a better future, even if it meant carrying a heavy burden in silence. But as she looked at him now, standing there beside her, Emily realized that the strength her father had shown wasn't just in his ability to protect and fight. It was in his decision to leave behind a world of violence, to start over and build a life that was about peace, not power. It took a different kind of strength to walk away from a past like that, to choose love over the darkness that had once defined him. "Sometimes, the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run," John said, his voice quiet but full of truth. "But when it does, you face it on your own terms. You don't let it control you. You take back the power it tried to steal from you." Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with admiration. "You've already done that, Dad. You've already taken it back." John gave a small smile, the kind that spoke of years of wisdom and understanding. "Maybe," he said, "but it's a constant fight. The past never truly lets go. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. We keep moving forward, no matter what." As they stood there in the quiet of the evening, the weight of their conversation settling between them, Emily felt a sense of peace. The world was far from perfect, and the challenges they had faced were just the beginning. But she knew, deep down, that they were ready for whatever came next. They had faced their fears, their past, and come out stronger on the other side. And that, Emily realized, was the true meaning of strength. "Do you ever think about going back?" Emily asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Back to the life you left behind?" John was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he thought about the question. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't think about it much anymore. The past is behind me, and I've learned to leave it there. What matters now is what we do with the present, and how we shape the future. I've made my peace with what I was. Now, I have to focus on what I am. And what I want to be." Emily nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The past was always going to be a part of them, but it didn't define who they were anymore. They had both grown, learned, and adapted. The lessons they had learned, the strength they had built, were what would carry them forward. "You're right," Emily said softly. "We can't change the past, but we can decide how we live today. And we'll make sure our future is one we can be proud of." John placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "That's right, Em. We've faced a lot already, but there's still a lot ahead. We'll face it together, no matter what." And in that moment, as the last light of the day faded into twilight, Emily understood. True strength wasn't about fighting battles. It wasn't about being the toughest or the strongest. It was about standing up for what mattered most, even when the odds were against you. It was about being willing to face the truth, to confront the past, and to keep moving forward with the people you loved by your side. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Emily felt a quiet resolve settle in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't afraid. They had faced the worst, and they had come through it together. And no matter what happened, they would always have each other. Together, they could face anything. "Let's go inside," Emily said, her voice steady and strong. "We've got a lot of work to do tomorrow." John nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think we've earned a rest tonight," he said, his voice warm with pride. As they turned and walked toward the house, Emily looked up at the stars above, a sense of peace and hope filling her heart. They had survived, they had learned, and now, they were ready to face whatever came next together.